Well, this is certainly a very depressing recording and subject matter to get into. So, I mean, I've studied now the Expropriation Without Compensation Bill, uh, the proposed Expropriation Without Compensation Bill, and it's quite frankly a mess. I mean, it doesn't work in law, um, but it does work in the current institutionalized corruption that law and the jurisprudence in South African law has uh, whittled down uh, the structure and the tradition of the South African legal tradition, um, in that essentially it's hinged on capitalizing on uh, this erosion and corrosion of essentially legal values. I mean, specifically the rule of law, but which, I mean, we must remember Nelson Mandela wouldn't sign bills because he said that they didn't meet the requirements of the rule of law. Um, but essentially, let me just underline why this doesn't pass the bar of the rule of law is because the plenary power contained in the expropriation without compensation is incorrigible. It has no objective criteria. Uh, it just is basically an ideological treatise about the public interest, which is essentially uh, awarded to the state and the state's executive to define in whatever ideological framework or whatever ideologically intended well meaning purpose they might have uh, to expropriate in terms of the public interest. And so, in some sense, this is all hinged on the ideological circus that equality is a right and not a practice, and that equality is enshrined within the doctrine of social justice and identity politics, and vesting moral consideration not in the individual, but in some kind of group identity or in some kind of group factionalism, uh, and essentially the expropriation without compensation bill is a direct child of this new epoch, essentially, where identity politics has become the endorsed ideology that many judicial figures uh, use essentially to not look under the skirt of this, quite frankly, alien adaptation to South African law that the government, that the executive holds a prerogative power um, which cannot be examined or invigilated by the judiciary. That we don't question the ideology of the state because they have won a democratic mandate and therefore their vision must be unquestioned so long as it is hypothetically rational and hypothetically within a legitimate government purpose, of which they are now seeking to sort of redraw and redemarcate by a constitutional amendment. So this is uh, the ill of our time, where essentially you have um, a legal positivism, a disgusting, hollowing out and betrayal of values, specifically the betrayal of non-racialism, that falls in with this general ideological schema of identity politics, uh, so that you end up with legal structures and legal stricture which is incorrigible enough that you can kind of pass off a kind of ideologically intentioned, uh, um, because you can just put in pretty words public interest. Well, as long as it's done in the name of the public interest, that's good enough. But that's not how law is supposed to be structured. It's supposed to have real criteria. It's supposed to have real teeth that show, where certain lines are. And in some sense, you can say, well, maybe it's in the public interest that the government of the day should fall on their own sword in terms of making policy that doesn't function, and that they should not be able to expropriate without compensation in order to promote the intermediate goal of the government's ideological vision, because they should be judged on their fruitlessness of their ideological machination. So that is how democracy functions, that it's in the public interest that the government of the day should have to contend with the structure of the law. And not to mention also the fact that if you look at the fact, I think that there is some look, I'm a strong constitutionalist, so I actually believe that in some sense the Constitution cannot even be amended by Parliament. Some act can be amended in Parliament, and in some sense, if you wish to amend the Constitution, you're not even changing the Constitution. What you're doing is you're creating a further lens through which that the original Constitution is articulated. And in some sense, you cannot create an iterative amendment that does not properly comport and in some sense elaborate. In some sense, you can only elaborate the Constitution. You can't amend it. Obviously, technically, it counts as amending it in terms of when you amend the bill, but you're not amending the actual Constitution, which was not created by Parliament. It was created by the Constitutional Assembly. And if you want to compare Parliament today to the original Constitutional Assembly, we have to at least recognize that the level at which people vote, at which that they are eligible to vote, is much, much lower. And if we had to say that people and the seats in Parliament had to be proportional to the eligible voter base and not merely just the people who turn out at the ballot box who didn't know that their constitutional rights were up for evolution and adaptation and radical rearrangement, then you start to perhaps more correctly contrast the Constitutional Assembly with the current state of the current Parliament, and quite frankly the illegitimacy of the current Parliament to make these kinds of changes to the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. But obviously the courts will certainly not stand up for the constitutional rights and the constitutional values, as they have already endorsed ideological schema which quite frankly even contradict the Constitution as it currently stands, or as it should stand, and as it is structured, in essentially adding the governmental prerogative into the mix of criteria which allows them to judge the infringement of citizens' rights within the mechanism of the practice of equality, which they take to be the right of equality held by sort of social justice units of group identity. So since they already accept the ideological governmental prerogative to say that the right of equality, which is, there is no such thing, there's not a right of equality, there's the practice of equality, which is how you fairly balance the infringement of rights. Which is not being properly tested. The judiciary has essentially failed in its task, and there's a good reason why it fails in this task. It's because essentially the institutionalized corruption in the ANC between the split prerogative is the only way that the ANC functions in its corrupt form, in some sense. That because look, it's probably correct that the judiciary has some idea of a governmental prerogative, but the governmental prerogative has absolutely no bearing against the function of the rights in the Bill of Rights and the limitation of the rights in the Bill of Rights, which must be limited only in terms of clause of the limitations clause in Section 36. That's the only way that you can limit a right, is Section 36. But they are limiting a right beyond Section 36 by this stupid adaptation of our law, which quite frankly comes from American jurisprudence, which is completely inappropriate in the South African legal context and framework. But this allows essentially, look, even if you were to allow a governmental prerogative, you cannot let Cyril Ramaphosa be under the force of another prerogative power like the NEC chairmanship. I mean, for example, Britain has rules against this. The Prime Minister cannot have an executive force and an executive power exerted against him. Um, the idea that the NEC chairman can give the president of the state and of the executive in government his marching orders on ideological and policy grounds is unconscionable. I mean, in a legal framework in which you're going to respect a governmental prerogative, you can't have a governmental prerogative in which that prerogative is essentially superseded by a separate private prerogative. Um, I mean, in some sense, I mean, this matter only matters, and it shouldn't matter, because if the prerogative is something that can't be trumped or can't be invigilated by the courts, but it should be invigilated by the courts because there is no such defense, essentially, that this issue can't be examined because it falls under the governmental prerogative. There is no governmental prerogative when it comes to the limitation of rights in the Bill of Rights. And Section 9, the equality, how the practice of equality is enshrined, is a very delicate sort of thing that has to be read very carefully in conjunction with Section 36. And there is no getting out of cases A, B, C, D, E, especially case E. Are there less severe measures that could reach the same purpose? I mean, and that's a clear argument which the government itself must even preemptively answer that question, because if they can't answer that question, then it is clear that the infringement cannot be justified. And you cannot just say, well, it's our ideological prerogative, because we are the government of the day, to define the means to the ends. And you can't look at the means, you can only judge us based on our purported objective, our purported goal, our purported vision, when that vision in practice does not function, is dysfunctional, and is quite frankly incorrigible, and the courts have accepted incorrigibility based on some, quite frankly, abandonment and betrayal of value, and values that the New South Africa is founded on, which essentially has been killed and murdered by these judges and by these fascist politicians and by this fascist form of politics and this fascist form of amoralism, which has crept in everywhere, because now we have the Expropriation Without Compensation Bill, which is basically proof that this formulae that has already been politically tested in the arena and has essentially endured, because essentially we are a state that has had all of its values hollowed out, because essentially the judges have gone along with the institutionalized corruption of the state. They have gone along with the erosion of the rule of law. So, as soon as you have a kind of incorrigible standard, and then everything else can just associate with that standard of incorrigibility, because it has the right purpose, ideological vision sort of conjoined with it, and under that cover, then you can get away with whatever malfeasance you want. And it doesn't matter how patently corrupt it is, doesn't matter how inconsistent it is with the spirit of the Constitution and the rule of law. It all gets by because it's hypothetically feasible. It's hypothetically, like, within the realm of technical possibility, that it might work. Never mind that it doesn't work in practice. Never mind that essentially it's I mean, the split prerogative aspect of it, in some sense, is just another facet and manifestation of its deep unethical, amoral substrate. Um, they're essentially, it's in some sense, it's a technical vortex. It's a technical lacuna which is created in order to sort of hide uh, 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 the incoherent ideological rationale, which never gets to sort of be judged in the political arena for what it is. It's never been able to be named because it has this kind of pseudo legal paper over and disguise while the courts are going along with it. It hasn't been ruled unconstitutional. So the status of justice about, let's say, the ideological status of social justice is kept alive as a plausible um, cover that there is something about social justice which at least has not been overtly rejected from the legal jurisprudence. And I mean, I would just call this ideological partisanship on behalf of the bench. The bench itself has essentially used this ideological identity politics to cover over the entrenchment of the institutionalized corruption politically in the ANC that now has essentially corrupted all of South African law. And we must remember the gem, the great precious value that South African law has in its history, that the South African courts were actually able to stand up against the apartheid government. I mean, obviously, they weren't able to defeat apartheid, but they were able to radically at least contain apartheid within some limits, because obviously we didn't have a liberal constitution in the era of apartheid, but we did have the general substantive rule of law and certain, so much so that the apartheid government felt so restricted by the courts that they even sought to invent their own high court of parliament in order to avoid having to go through and be challenged in court, because they lost so much in South African courts that they tried to invent their own creature of statutes, that their own high court of parliament. And what did the real high court in South Africa do? It said, no, parliament, you can't even do that. Like that, it's almost laughable. And they almost, I believe, they couldn't even give a good enough reason, because it was just so palpably um, absurd on its face. It was fundamentally based on trying to make an incorrigible lack of integrity. It was essentially, it was like a bad joke, and which is a lot of what fascism is. It's a bad joke that no one is allowed to laugh at or openly, because then you kind of you switch on the extreme threats from it. I mean, you can just imagine sort of putting down the fascists in the current South African parliament. You can just imagine if you did speak truth in that fora, how essentially the rules would be leveraged against you in the most kind of absurd sort of way that would sort of be hollowing out their own values on their face, and I mean, you've seen this before when the speaker has spoken out on behalf of kind of ideologically protecting um, the underpinned structure that the current form of institutionalized corruption is sort of wedded to, and this is where you get the sort of the hard boiling of democracy between the ANC and the EFF, between the rock and the hard place. And so, you just keep on essentially destroying. I mean, already the values of the new South Africa are explicitly and patently, even by the president himself, repudiated. They are constantly essentially thrown under the bus um, as essentially passe. Uh, because I mean, even the ANC's own ideological substrate and structure is premised on incorrigibility, is premised on this institutionalized corruption of the law itself, even, and of values. And so, anyway, I mean, it's such a toxic mess. I mean, to clean it up, you would have to say, well, uh, you people in the EFF, you do realize that what you say is antithetical to the values of the Constitution. But I mean, in some sense, you can't have the speaker saying this openly, because in some sense it doesn't make sense, because the courts themselves have not rejected this ideological racism, because it's called social justice. So I mean, you reinvent the meaning of words, and then people are allowed to get away with whatever they want, because rhetorically you can stick a happy word on its title. You can say, well, it's because we want a just and equal society. It can all sort of be housed under the word equity or something like that. So because you can sort of stick a happy word on it, it's sort of, you can hijack moral language, you can hijack ethical charges and accusations. Um, and then if you argue against those ethical accusations, then you get said that you're the one breaking the rules, when in some sense that whole strategy and tactic are the people that should be ejected from parliament, essentially. I mean, the EFF, for ideological reasons, should, in some sense, be rebuked by the Speaker of the House for being inconsistent with the Supreme Constitution, for openly declaring war on the values and even the rights in the Supreme Constitution, and should be ejected on that basis. That they are not allowed to sit in Parliament and to essentially create propaganda and hate speech, um, and also to undermine uh, the structure of the Constitution. But in some sense, it's more important that if those arguments were actually met and defended, um, in some sense, I would only throw the EFF out because of their lack of ability to engage in discourse. That essentially, I would table a debate and actually hold the debate and actually properly have it argued out, as it were. But in as much as that, the debate would not be, these people can't debate. They have no real argument. They only have their disgusting fascistic political trickery and rhetoric and hyperbole. Um, and so in some sense it would be very slippery, because like trying to debate sort of a snake, a serpent with a forked tongue. That would be the kind of trickery that it would be in. And you would see quite toxic hyperbolic language. You would see sort of every trick in the book. You would see the kind of the sympathy grabbing, sort of denial of pragmatic reality, and you would get the labeling of pragmatic reality as some kind of racist force. So you know you would see sort of the whole. And in some sense, you would need to be quite clever in such a debate, to juxtapose correctly those kinds of arguments against the transparency and openness of the state, to be corrigible in its own policy, so that it can actually be brought down in an open and liberal way, that it will be accountable for the effects of its policy, and not just the propaganda of essentially of the rationale that underpins the policy, but it actually the fruit of the policy, as it were. What's weird in the current epoch, and political arena, is how essentially the ANC, in some sense, Cyril Ramaphosa is a perfect poster boy for this form of leadership, where it's essentially it's not responsible for its own decisions that it takes. Somehow, all of the negative repercussions are somebody else's fault, and it's sort of and there's no real control, there's no real ownership over the course that the ship is sailing through. And in some sense, the lack of ownership of responsibility um, is essentially the hallmark of identity politics in some sense. That it's never your fault when your policy fails. Um, it's always just more racial conspiracy theory and ideological vitriol. And so it has this, endless mechanism to double down on its own rhetoric, on its own toxic and divisive rhetoric. And where does the buck ever end? Well, the buck, where does the buck stop? The buck stops with the scapegoat, with the ideological scapegoat. And then they can sort of, on the way there, they goad you into insulting them as being inhuman, and in some sense they are inhuman, not because they're like insects, although I mean in some sense you could describe them as a kind of hive insect, because they see themselves as a kind of imperial sort of queen of their collective identity. So I mean that analogy actually does work, but in some sense it's more demonic. It's more like we are legion. We are many. That is the rationale. We deserve dominion because we are many. And we speak for the collective. We speak for us. That is exact. That they are, in some sense, by collectivizing their dignity into an identity, into an external locus of control, which needs a Führer, which needs a representative. So I mean, it's very hard to battle fascism within a system that is made for open liberal democratic debate, when you've got someone who is quite cynically and jadedly trying to undermine but use the rules of the game, essentially. Because then they say, well, if you call us a fascist, then aren't you undermining the rules of your liberal, open, democratic, transparent sort of political system of contesting ideas and opinions? But at some point, democracy does actually have to say, no, no, no. The kind of toxic political rhetoric that you are producing, and the kind of toxic ideology that you are using to disguise your poison, is essentially antithetical to democracy. And if you can't say that people's politics is antithetical to democracy, and that it is causing constitutional damage, and that it has caused constitutional damage, but in some sense, the proximate cause of this constitutional damage did not start in politics. It started with the academy. It started with professors and academics and their race and gender studies and their radical race theory and their radical critical race theory and intersectional feminism. That's where it started. That's where the egregious sexism and racism was normalized in society. I mean, it was the same in Weimar Germany. I mean, Aryan studies was not a politically mandated curriculum. Aryan studies was promulgated by the universities, by academia. It was spread. Fascism comes from the pseudo-intellectual caste of people who think they have found a way to sort of take a kind of amoral sociology, because in some sense you have to understand that sociology is a reductive science. But it's also, technically it's in the field of philosophy. Sociology is a field of philosophy. So we've got a field of philosophy that has manufactured a kind of amoral philosophical framework, and that amoralism doesn't fit within the ethics and the values of the Supreme Constitution, but instead the Supreme Constitution did not defend itself against the academics. It did not allow, it said, no, 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 there's such a thing as academic freedom. And the courts, I believe that the politics of the day should not have anything to do with academic freedom. But the courts need to fucking defend themselves and defend the Constitution from fucking fascists, which is what we have suffered through. And through the capture of academia, we have then had to suffer through the capture of journalism, who think that they're oh so smart, rubbing shoulders with these racist and sexist academics, who have created this convoluted philosophical nonsense and incoherent bullshit. And so we have normalized in a whole generation essentially a kind of borderline personality disordered culture in which kind of the narcissistic injury of the identity and the self-conception has become essentially the soapbox through which any borderline personality disordered or sort of cerebral histrionic can sort of rattle on about their individual narcissistic gripe against the systemic oppression. And then you've created essentially an open door to the Jewish conspiracy theory as my analogy, the conspiracy theory of white privilege. When we already had a developmental state, we already had a progressive state with implementation, with the keys of transformative implementations of policy to address disadvantage. And instead of judging those policies as being suboptimal and being essentially incapable of delivering their promises because there's something wrong with the policy, instead we just said, no, we need more of this ideological poison in our culture. And so we have essentially completely eroded the functioning of the Constitution. And that formula is now being doubled down with expropriation without compensation. And so, I mean, technically the proximate cause of the corruption in the state is essentially the misapplication of Section 9 of the Constitution to endorse, what has been called, quite ironically, the Promotion of Equality Act, because the Promotion of Equality Act is probably the most social justice infused racist document that you can imagine, and it's the kind of doublespeak that sort of existed in the turn from Weimar Germany to fascist Nazi Germany. It's this kind of deplorable ethical filth which has been bought wholesale by the courts because of inverted commas governmental prerogative. So our culture has sort of been body snatched by essentially neo-fascists. You can see this quite clearly in the EFF. I mean, you can just imagine what would happen if someone would even call them fascists openly in Parliament. These are people who are literally LARPing as Adolf Hitler, Julius Malema is LARPing as Adolf Hitler, and with even the tin soldier marching, and it's that whole model of politics. I mean, has just been normalized as part of the liberal spectrum, as it were. And in some sense, this is because we have already hard-boiled the democracy. The Constitution is dead. De facto, it is dead. The question is, can it be resurrected, is the real question. I mean, I do think that at this point we need, actually, if I could, and please listen to my words very carefully, because I'm going to qualify what I say, and it must be taken in context, because if it's truncated what I say, then the meaning becomes the opposite. But essentially what I would wish to do is I would wish to orchestrate a coup that does not take over the government, that does not even touch any political party whatsoever. But what this coup would do is it would organize a judicial revolution in which all the judges that have endorsed this ideological and political institutionalized corruption must be impeached. And a quorum of judges must be organized in order to create some kind of defense against what is now an illegitimate constitutional court. And in some sense, when I say a coup that would accomplish this, it would be essentially perhaps not to reform the judiciary in the entire country, but to reform the judiciary at least in some section of the country to which there could be said to be some kind of democratic disjunction with which is in some senses only the Western Cape. So I would essentially beseech the Western Cape judiciary to construct their own constitutional court and to affirm the original constitution and to keep that original constitution intact and to reject all legislation that is incompatible with the original constitution. And that essentially then, and within their own ranks, they need to impeach those judges who are not capable of defending the values and the rights in the Bill of Rights in the original constitution. And essentially, the coup that I speak about would only be essentially to protect the judges in constructing such a quorum and finding among their rank and file so in some sense, I would beseech the judges themselves to perform a judicial revolution which would be protected by a coup, in order to protect the sanctity of the South African Constitution. And I would say this explicitly as well, because the Western Cape has its own constitution, and its constitution quite firmly provides a direct link to the supremacy of the Constitution and an allegiance to the supremacy of the Constitution. And the question simply is what is the definition of that Supreme Constitution? Is it an act of Parliament that merely gets amended whenever Parliament so wishes to amend it, with a supermajority, in a flailing supermajority that if would not qualify as a supermajority in terms of its representative force even 10 years ago? I believe that if you're going to vote for the amendment of the Constitution within a supermajority, that the Parliament itself should count itself with empty seats proportional at least to that of the representation symbolized by the Constitutional Assembly. At the very least, I mean, otherwise it pales in comparison. How can you have a less representative body performing surgery, extractive surgery? See, it's one thing to have augmentative surgery that is amending so as to elaborate, so as to enhance. It's another thing, and in some sense, even when it tries to enhance, you have to still see the original. You have to read it from the original to the enhancement. So I'm not against the amendment of the Constitution. I am against derogation of the original Constitution, of the Supreme Constitution. And there is only one Constitution, and it was passed by the Constitutional Assembly. And it is not to be eroded by some so-called supermajority, which is in some sense, unless you take my qualification of the empty seats, it's not plausible. It's simply not plausible. But for other reasons, for substantive reasons, these tentative amendments to the Constitution can be overtly, declaratively, already preemptively be rejected by the courts. But in some sense, that won't happen because of the institutionalized corruption on the level of the current constitutional court, which has already failed its mandate and failed in its sacred duty to protect the sanctity of the Supreme Constitution. And it does so in terms of its acceptance of the ideological poison, which is part of the inherent nature of the Promotion of Equality Act in itself. And I mean, you can see this, in terms of how judges have given speeches where they have essentially declared themselves as ideological partisans on the bench, and how they have essentially wholesale endorsed the ideological proclivity of the ruling party, as they have replicated the institutionalized corruption between the split prerogative between the NEC chairmanship and the executive and president of the state, wrestling that governmental prerogative between the two when there should be no such thing in the invigilation of the infringement of rights according to the limitations clause. Anyway, so and I realize that the reconciliation between Section 9 and Section 36 um, is not just a merely simple matter. It is a complicated matter to some degree, but do all your workings out on the paper and do it thoroughly and make sure that you've got every aspect covered. And when you do that, you quite clearly get up into the clear reconciliation that you have to do the limitations clause twice. You have to do it for essentially everyone involved. Perhaps I should get into the nitty gritty of it. I mean, there are lots of ways of talking through it, and it is a bit sloppy to just talk through it. But the idea that Section 9 is sort of giving you a way so that you can simply avoid doing the limitations clause is patently absurd. It's ridiculous. Um, that you can somehow speciously trump one of the five cases A, B, C, D, E. When you have to consider all those things, and the application of case E is undeniable. You always have to answer for case E. Otherwise, it's simply not justifiable. And essentially, the use of social justice and identity politics in order to blunt the application of Section 36 is, in some sense, the proof in the pudding of the institutionalized corruption of the judiciary. Now, there are measures in which in the COVID in I mean COVID has followed this formula as well. Um, I'm just going to read something that is just eminently a reasonable standard that is in some sense so much common sense and that it is even in the spirit of our law as well. But the group member should not permit laws to be passed which limit or proscribe the activities of all the members of the group because of the failure of some of the members of the group. In some sense, that is exactly what the COVID-19 legislation has pierced the veil thereof, of that very basic tenet of common sense. And in some sense, you can say, well, what I just read out was that the members of the group should not permit. But in some sense, the judiciary needs to recognize that standard, that when the members of the group speak out against that kind of infraction against the group at large, and when that infraction has occurred and members of the group are not allowing that standard to be broached because it is an impermissible ethical line in the sand. That if you rationalize the the disruption of that, you are essentially saying that we don't live in a liberal place anymore, that we live in an authoritarian place instead. And I understand that the needs of public health are in a peculiar and their own sort of unique, sort of realm. I am sensitive to that, but we have to just take into account very simple facts. One of those facts being that the World Health Organization's um, uh, 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 suggestions and the World Health Organization's best practices and for lockdowns, even themselves, the purpose of those lockdowns were never promoted under the guise of a means towards eradication. It was never um, said by the World Health Organization that lockdowns should eradicate the virus. The point of lockdowns was, is, and in terms of the World Health Organization, and even in terms within our municipal law, was to control the spread, not to end the virus. This is very important. That this blurring of this actual objective goal, that essentially it was to make the virus manageable, not to eradicate the virus. And when you take that into account, you start to see the lax reasonability of all of these kinds of restrictions, which in a lot of way I think exacerbated the mutation of the virus. Because the faster that the virus can spread through a population, the less opportunity there is for mutation. And when we were, I mean, and you could see that this aspect was suppressed, I would say culturally suppressed, but also by the state propaganda, essentially, that even, I mean, okay, this is a bit anecdotal, but I believe it was around the time of March, or uh, um, or maybe early April, or maybe I believe it was, maybe it was even in February, but I believe it was around March, maybe very early April. I was listening to an expert, a local expert, on the radio being interviewed, um, and right at the end of a 30-minute interview, um, the expert suggested that we should ease the lockdown restrictions, uh, which was taken rather incredulously by the journalist host. Um, and this was not followed up on at all. It was, in some sense, it was completely suppressed. But he said, well, we have to understand that we have actually a lot of spare capacity in the hospitals right now, and so like we should not slow down the spread of this virus through the population. Um, because otherwise, why are we doing that? It doesn't make sense, essentially. I mean, still, the usefulness of a vaccine is unproven, it's untested. We, as a species, as a human species in epidemiology, have never gone to war with a COVID virus before. We have never tried to vaccinate for a COVID virus before. We're in the realm of science fiction. We're in the realm of essentially of human experimentation. We've never done this before. We don't know what the long-term consequences will be, and in some sense, uh, these are very cold and hard things to get into. But public health is a frightfully strange and complex set of of factors. The idea that we're not going to have endemic disease. I mean, in some sense, a lot of this, the idea, oh, we can do without COVID, as if we could essentially wipe out all endemic diseases. In which case, I would say, uh, why don't we focus on some other viruses to get rid of before we get rid of COVID? I mean, if the world cannot eradicate malaria, perhaps we should be a little bit more um, humble. And this is the problem when you're dealing with experts who are not being honest about their field, and when things from their field are being hyperbolically projected into a state narrative and a state propaganda in a cherry-picked sort of way, in which the field itself is being horribly misrepresented. Public health as a field in itself is similarly being horribly misrepresented. And in some sense, if you did want to go the route of eradication, which some countries have succeeded in doing, which is, I would say, not a plausible goal in many places in the world, and is it worth eradicating a virus when in other places in the world it's not necessarily, or we don't yet know if it's capable of being eradicated? Because if you in a country, in a singular country, have successfully eradicated a virus and your population is essentially doesn't have a naturally generated immunity, and if the vaccine proves to be ineffectual because of mutation in the future, uh, now you have created uh, an insoluble dilemma. Now you've got an intractable problem. So if the vaccine does not successfully eradicate the virus, and in some sense, uh, they often do not, especially this kind of virus, because COVID viruses mutate incredibly quickly. They're not like other viruses. They mutate excessively, and it is very likely that they will essentially going to war with the COVID virus with a vaccine is, I'm going to state again, it's human experimentation. It's never been done before. We have no idea what we are doing. And the likelihood that this will go well for us, I think, is sadly, and unless we commit ourselves to wiping out every viral pathogen possible, um, which I also think is also a science fiction goal. So, what we do is we have these experts which are not without controversy within their own field, standing up on soapboxes that have been lent to them by politicians and by state propaganda narrative. In some sense, the narrative has been already orchestrated for us by identity politics, because this is how identity politics works, is you create this systemic oppression. You create this unreasonable expectation that you can essentially wish away endemic virus if we could just be better. We just need to be better as a collective, as a society, and we just need to kind of have some kind of lowest common denominator. As we do things as we supposedly reach towards things that we don't really find ourselves committed to, which is that, are we really committed to eradicating the virus? I mean, it's crazy. Like, this shows you the fundamental lack of leadership. Either we're trying to eradicate the virus through a lockdown, or we're just actually trying to conserve medical resources so that essentially we can not have excess deaths due to lack of medical resources, which in some sense was also very badly orchestrated and administered by the state. And so instead, you have essentially blaming people for not observing a very strict lockdown, as if the lockdown was invented to eradicate the virus, which was not the policy. Or it was the policy if you kind of read between the lines of the propaganda narrative of the state and of the weird kind of journalism which was suppressing that thread that I stated, which was even explicitly given by an expert at the end of a 30-minute interview. In the last 30 seconds of a 30-minute interview, he says, well, actually, we should ease off the restrictions of the lockdown because, obviously the lockdown is not an eradication strategy. So if it's not an eradication strategy, what are we waiting for? And then we end up with mutations as we have ended up with, which I would say is direct correlation to this continuing slowdown of the virus. And the virus wants to spread. That's what it does. And so when you stop it from spreading, then it gets more virulent because life finds a way. Especially COVID viruses are very good at adapting and evolving. So we force ourselves into a weird science fiction setting in which we're battling against all endemic disease or all endemic viruses, which is itself also a problematic goal, because even if you succeed in destroying COVID, now what you have done is you have essentially, and this is a horrible thing to say, but it is actually an aspect of public health, that every year many thousands of people die to the normal flu. And so now what you are doing is if we're going to go to war with flu, what this means is that I mean, some flus in some seasons are less deadly than other flus. And sometimes you have very mildly deadly flus many years in a row. And then you have a worse flu which seems to kill more than its fair share, because essentially it's not because that flu was that much worse, it's because the preceding flus were that much um, undeadly. And so you have this idea of, well, there's a relative sort of equilibrium here. And if it's not being taken up by flus and flu viruses, then it's going to be taken up by other viruses which we are going to let within our species propagate. Because we're going to give them incubators which would have been cleared away by deadly flus. But if we're not going to have deadly flus anymore, then what are we going to have? We're going to have immunocompromised people that are ready and waiting to incubate other diseases. And so, in some sense, I mean, humans used to have to worry about bubonic plague, which is in some sense not. We don't have to put up with the bubonic plague in most places in the world. In some sense, it still exists in China, in fact. They still have bouts of bubonic plague. Um, but we're going to start seeing perhaps things like that come back. We're going to start seeing other viruses. We're going to start perhaps seeing very virulent forms of measles, perhaps, because this is how public health works. It's a dynamic field, it's a big field. In some sense, you have to remember that air travel, air travel specifically, has probably stopped us from having to suffer from deadly flus. We used to, every 20 to 30 years, we used to have flus that would kill children at the same rate that they killed adults. COVID, by no means, kills children at the same rate that it kills elderly people. And if we take that into account, and we then therefore understand that COVID is by no means a deadly flu, because a real deadly flu is like the Spanish flu. And we used to have Spanish flus basically every 20 to 30 years because people were isolated. And now we're isolating ourselves again because of COVID restrictions and lockdown. So instead of taking the pain, as it were, and I mean, our immune systems essentially in the modern age have protected us, I would say. Air travel has actually been a boon in public health. I mean, people forget, but when people, because of sea travel, used to expose each other because pathogens would be locked into the insularity of a society, and then when you had people traveling far afield uh, through a ship voyage, they would step out and then they would spread their disease to which the local population had no cultivated immunity. And there are lots of different forms of immunity as well, but which make it complicated within a population. It's a whole, because people's physiology is not all the same. People have different mechanisms. Anyway, um, so it's important, I would say, to know that because I mean, in some sense, one of those mechanisms. I mean, there's so many things that are basically unknown, but some of those mechanisms might include the adaptation of a virus. That a virus mutates not only because necessarily of itself, but because of a particular form of um, an immuno sort of process and response in which the virus is being enculturated into a more virulent strain that is perhaps this is perhaps a kind of speculative science fiction myself in some sense, but perhaps that's part of almost like a natural vaccination. When I say natural, I mean an organically induced form of sort of vaccine modulation of the anyway. That there might be some immunoprocesses and responses in some, because as I say, like people don't have the same immunoresponse mechanics within themselves. We have existed as a social organism. We have existed as a we don't all have the same blood type. We don't all have the same so there's a huge mix of these things happening. Um, anyway, and so public health, when it's being taken over by these experts who are not honest about the the holes in their field and the humility that their field needs to have, as they subject us to a kind of group human experimentation, which quite frankly I would say is, if you want to look at how our species responds to disease in the modern era, we should count ourselves quite lucky, especially because essentially, I mean, we're running out of other things. At least on viruses, we're not doing too badly, to tell the truth. In some sense, bacteria is a much bigger problem for us because we've been blowing through all antibiotics. Antibiotic resistant bacterial strains are soon going to become a real sort of problem, or as it ever increasingly, in some sense, that is only being fixed. Anyway, I don't want to generalize and talk too much, but at some point, someone has to speak up for the immune system. And the more that we try to subvert, let's say, actual immune activation, as it were, or the upkeep of an immune system, um, into this hypothetical world of science fiction in which that we can wish away endemic disease. That's actually on the table. No one's put that on the fucking table. So the idea that we kind of have, according to the weirdly, if you read in between the lines of the state propaganda, is, in my mind, quite frankly, um, you know, it's something that needs to be taken into account in terms of the judges, which I understand themselves perhaps don't want to stick their head above the parapet because of this runaway sort of media fueled frenzy and reality tunnel. But this is the reality tunnel, which is in some sense which has come to us as a package, normalized to us by identity politics. And so because it's already happened in principle in some sense, we're screwed. Because this formula has been tried and tested and proven, and people are running with it, we already have a runaway democracy that cannot be held to account. And in some sense, it's because our judges did not protect us from these academics, and now these academics have had, in a metaphorical sense, has had their abominations, their child abomination, or their children, uh, in the form of these monstrous journalists. So now we have a whole we have a whole generation of beastly journalism, which is completely conditioned by this narrative, and it cannot be bred out from them, and they cannot find their integrity because they believe that dignity is the ultimate value, and dignity is not vested in the individual. No, fuck the individual. It's vested in the social construct. It's vested in the collective identity, and all morality is seated in the collective identity, which obviously someone has to speak for the collective identity because it can't speak for itself. Because the collective cannot repent, cannot be humble about itself. It can only have pride because it is an abomination, it is a monster. And we have these journalists who protect this abomination because we've had these academics that promoted that ideology, and we had these judges who did not rally against these academics, which should have been charged with constitutional damages, which should have been locked up for their constitutional betrayal and undermining and undercutting and disgusting So I mean, we have the recreation of Nazi Germany. We have the recreation of this unassailable um, scientific uh, uh, expertise and prerogative. Anyone with a white lab coat can come around and proffer their strange and controversial sort of, well, our field tells us that this is our best guess, that this is our, yeah, and in some sense it's completely misaligned with the idea that, well, is it possible to eradicate this virus? Even with a vaccine, is it possible to eradicate this virus? Probably not. Probably not. Let's just, talk to any expert on that particular question. Never mind that the strategy, the political strategy being fulfilled, is somewhat somehow entrenched and tethered to that crazy outlook. You know, like, so we have these prognoses by these epidemiologists who, quite frankly, I mean, I can only think, these are. This is the problem of intelligence, is that obviously not every field is going to have smart people. This is perhaps why we should be listening to Sunepta Gupta, who is actually honest about Professor Sunepta Gupta of Oxford University, the top epidemiologist in Oxford University. And she is honest about the humility that her field must be taken within. She is honest about the kinds of speculation which I have, in a sense, narrated already here, which is that, you know, air travel has been the most wonderful thing for public health because we used to have real deadly flus, which we don't anymore. And, and we get more of this propaganda that the death rate is 1.6%. Never mind, well, how many asymptomatic cases have you taken into account? I mean, you can't use confirmed cases as a denominator. That's propaganda. I mean, why are you saying that there's a death rate of 1.6% of confirmed cases? That is an utterly meaningless and uncontextualized statistic. It is propaganda, quite frankly. And Sunepta Gupta is completely correct in pointing out that that statistic is essentially a form of misrepresentation, is a form of pulling the wool over people's eyes. Um, but this is nothing new. This is exactly how identity politics functions. And we have journalists who are incapable of operating with any kind of real integrity as to the truth, as to finding out the answer, because they are morally conscripted within this formulae, which has been tried and tested by identity politics. So, I mean, again, we as a culture have been radicalized by identity politics, and liberal democracy and liberal values, as enshrined by the rule of law and as enshrined by the South African Constitution. And let me just say that, I mean, I could talk about other countries, but other countries don't actually have the rule of law. South Africa is the only country in the world that on paper can actually support the rule of law, that on paper actually has the rule of law. That sounds like an extreme statement to make, but it in fact isn't. Um, and apart from discrediting myself, I will say that the South African legal tradition combined with the South African Constitution, in my mind, is quite frankly the fulfillment of the Ark of the Covenant. But that's my personal view on the matter, which perhaps makes me sound too much like a crackpot to be making these other lines of arguments. But anyway, and it's certainly a fight worth having over preserving, uh, so that the South African democratic revolution of 1994 is not destroyed um, by people who, quite frankly, are eminently corrupt, are eminently morally corrupt, and it is their ethical corruption and destruction of the structure of the law, which is the proximate cause of the failure of the new South Africa. Because we cannot even see the corruption because it is disguised by the the failure of the reflection that the law should have provided, which has been circumvented.